Well, welcome to another of our NWBA reflections, and thank you for joining me. It's been great to hear from people who have been using these, and thank you for being in touch. But one thing that has come to light in some of those conversations is that not everyone is aware that we also produce these, which are really just some of the questions and comments that come out of these videos. And if you find it helpful to have these in a written form in front of you, then please do find them. You probably won't come across them if you access us through our YouTube channel, but if you go to our website, which the address is below on the front page on the left hand side, you'll see reflections. If you click on that box, that'll take you to a page, and underneath the access to each of these reflections you'll find a link which will take you to that piece of paper, or take you to an electronic version of it which you can look at or you can print. So if you find that useful, please do use it. You know, certain words are becoming quite commonplace in our society at the moment. Words like unprecedented and challenging and uncertain, because of course these are words that very much describe the situation in which we find ourselves. And it's been interesting for me to engage with people of Christian faith and to see how faith impacts our responses and often generates quite different expectations from people. You know, there are some people who really see that it's our faith that's going to get us through this, whereas others almost see faith as well, that's a way of believing that God's somehow going to protect us from what's going on around us. I've also talked to some churches who are telling me that people are getting in touch with them because people who maybe haven't traditionally taken much of an interest in things of faith, but recent events and circumstances have made them ask questions and think about things they haven't thought about before. But one thing that's really struck me as I've reflected on things is how much of the biblical narrative is actually set in situations that might also be described as uncertain and unprecedented and challenging. In fact, far more of the biblical narrative seems to be set in situations like that than just about anything else. You know, if you think about the Bible as being in different sections, then it begins with the history books, and this is very much a history of struggle. You've first got this somewhat dysfunctional family of Sarah and Abraham, Isaac and Rebecca, Jacob and then his 12 sons, and every generation of that family seems to be riddled with all kinds of rivalries and struggles. And the family becomes a nation, but it becomes a nation that is caught in the oppression of slavery. They eventually break free of their slavery, but then they become a community of displaced desert wanderers. Eventually they find a homeland, but that homeland has to be gained through invasion, which itself is a very difficult and troubling story. And then their early years there really are quite unsettled. Eventually along come the monarchs, but even David, the sort of great king figure, only ascends the throne after what is essentially a period of civil war. And then there perhaps is a degree of stability, but it's no more than 2 or 3 generations before there is division and decline, and then eventually invasion and exile. So the people of God are living out their lives against quite an uncertain backdrop. And after the history books come the poetry books, which, yes, include some great words of praise and worship, but an awful lot of it simply expresses the anguish and the struggle that's associated with much of the history that I've just described. And in the middle of the poetry, you've got the book of Job, which is pretty much entirely given over to describing a human struggle with affliction, all 42 chapters of it. And then come the prophets, who again are largely speaking into a situation of massive upheaval and uncertainty before we eventually find our way into the New Testament. The Gospels are a story of a pretty vulnerable family living as oppressed subjects of a brutal empire and then fleeing as refugees. They eventually do return to their homeland, but of course events come to their earthly climax in the execution of Jesus. The Acts of the Apostles are pretty much set against the backdrop of ongoing persecution. Half the epistles were written from prison cells, and then it all reaches its climax in the book of Revelation, which is written from where? A penal colony to which John has been deported, again as an act of religious persecution. So like I said, a huge proportion of the biblical narrative is set or written in times of significant uncertainty and upheaval and challenge. And I think that's maybe important for us, because it says to me that faith can be lived out in the troubling and the trying bits of life. Faith isn't about escaping them. It's not just about living through the easy and settled times. In fact, we might even argue that faith comes into its own in the tough stuff. And I want to invite you to dip into one of those stories for a few moments. And it's actually set in a period of reasonable stability in the life of the Old Testament people of God. And this is the story of one family's personal struggles in the midst of all of that. And we find it in the book of Ruth, tucked in between those two big eras of history that the Old Testament covers. And we're going to read some verses from the opening chapter of Ruth. But first, let me set the scene a little bit for you. The story begins in the family of Naomi and her husband Elimelech. They're part of the community of God's people, but there's a famine in the land. And so instead of staying put, Elimelech decides to take matters into his own hands and to head for a place called Moab and to seek a better life there, to kind of escape the struggle, to separate himself from God's people and to do his own thing. Ironic, really, because the name Elimelech means my God is king, but he decides to trust his own endeavours instead. Well, things don't go too well in Moab. Naomi, Elimelech and their two sons settle down there. The two sons marry, but all three men die, leaving three widows and no children, which in that culture really left the women with very little support. So Naomi decides to head back to Bethlehem, where she came from, and the two daughters-in-law accompany her to what we assume is the border, where they're supposed to leave her, head back to Moab and try to rebuild their own lives there. And this is where we join the story. One of the daughters, Orpah, makes her farewells and sets off back to Moab. But Ruth decides differently. So let's read it from Ruth chapter 1 and verses 15 to 19. Look, said Naomi, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her. But Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. When Naomi realised that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. And then the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. Now, when I was a child, growing up in Sunday school, if I'm honest, this story didn't do a lot for me. You see, in the room that we used to meet for Sunday school, there was a picture of this moment hanging on the wall, and it all looked a bit misty and Victorian and sentimental. It wasn't my thing. I've since learned actually that this was a print of a really famous painting by a guy called Philip Hermogenes Cauldron, which hangs in the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool and is a real part of our city's cultural heritage. But to me, it was just some soppy picture that looked old-fashioned and boring. And it was painted in the late Victorian period around 1886, and it's kind of typical of that era. But as I've got inside the story of Ruth, I've come to realise that actually this represents a whole lot more and is actually quite a significant story. You see, to me, this is a story about covenant. You sort of see that in the way in which Ruth makes this speech, which is more than just sentiment. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. You can almost feel the rhythm of it. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. And it's that last bit, which probably sounds a bit clumsy in English, but it's very much the structure of an oath in the original language that this is written. Now, the story of Ruth, at one level, is a really nice story. It is a bit like that picture that hangs in the Walker Art Gallery. It's romantic. She eventually meets a man who she marries and is able to provide support and identity for Naomi. It's sentimental. It's a classic story with a happy ending. And so, yes, it is really easy to take a quick glance at this story and just simply assume that it's there to tell us that God is the God of the happily ever afters. And maybe that works for us when life is going well. But if that's all our faith is founded on, then the wheels are going to come off when we find ourselves going through the mill. But this is more than just a human story of sentiment. And there's a whole other dimension to it that I'm not really going to go into too much, because Ruth becomes the great-grandmother of David, who of course becomes king. And it is of the house and line of David from which Jesus, the son of David, comes. So, like I said, this is a pretty important moment in our faith history. But what I want you to grasp is that Ruth could have known none of that when she made that pledge on the border trail between Moab and Canaan. In fact, if you look at the verses before, Naomi makes this point to her. You've got nothing to gain from sticking with me. She says, I can't give you a future. Go back to your own people. I'm just going home to throw myself at the mercy of the people I rejected in their moment of crisis. You'd be better off going back to Moab. But what I find interesting is that Ruth just doesn't engage in that argument at all. Don't urge me to leave you or turn back, she says, because this is not about you and me. It's not about taking a calculated risk in terms of whether Moab or Canaan offers me a better deal. And although Ruth makes this solemn commitment to Naomi, it's more than a commitment to Naomi. It's a commitment to God. And it's a commitment that stands out in contrast to what Naomi says, which is go back to the gods of Moab. And Ruth says, no, I'm going to commit myself to the God of Israel. And if you look at how her words are structured, you can see that. It starts with that don't urge me bit, and it ends with the may God deal with me ever so severely, which if you think about this narrative as being a bit like a club sandwich, then these are kind of the slices of bread on the top and the bottom. And then you've got a couple of statements either side. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay at the beginning, and then where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. So again, you could see the kind of contrast there: go, stay, die, bury. So if you like, that's the filling in the sandwich. And then there's that center slice, and that center bit, which is your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Now, this story was originally written in Hebrew. And Hebrew is a very structural language. So when you find a bit of text like this, you look for those structures, you look for the club sandwich, so to speak, because the middle bit is the sort of equivalent of the bold text or the large font in our printing. This is the heart of the whole story. And in Ruth and Elimelech, he's the husband from the beginning of the story, you have two contrasting ways of dealing with uncertainty and struggle. You see, as I've already said, Elimelech belonged to the people of God, and his name meant my God is king. But when it came to the crunch, he didn't live up to his name. When he faced challenge and uncertainty, well, he couldn't find what he felt he wanted in the community of God's people, so he simply headed off in search of a better deal. Now, we don't deny the struggle and the fear that must have come with that famine. But the community that Elimelech belonged to made it through. There were people waiting for Naomi with a barley harvest in the ground when she eventually arrived back. And like I said, to me, Ruth is the opposite of that. This is not about what's in it for me, she says. I know that I belong with God, and I know that I belong with God's people. That's where I want to be. That is what is going to be my foundation. Now, both of these women, Naomi and Ruth, faced really tough times. For Naomi, it was about going back to a life that she once lived, but returning empty and bitter and futureless. For Ruth, it was almost the opposite. It was about going to a strange land, a place she didn't know, alone, leaving all of her roots and security with nothing but her commitment to Naomi and to Naomi's God. And I've heard echoes of both of those experiences as I've talked to people about our own future. You know, some of us are talking about this new normal, which will mean for us trying to pick up the pieces of something that we once had. While for others of us, it may well feel like going into an unknown that we just don't know what'll be waiting for us. But it seems to me that the message of this story is don't hang on to the circumstances, hang on to God. At the heart of the Christian faith, there is also what Jesus describes as a covenant, a new covenant. And that covenant was also forged in some pretty tough circumstances. But we are a people of covenant, and Jesus made that covenant not to give us an easy ride, but to give us hope and assurance when we're facing the tough stuff. So if you regularly watch these videos, you know what I'm going to invite you to do. Find some time and space to read these words of covenant from the book of Ruth and simply ponder on each of those elements, and maybe start in the middle. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Just simply take some time to reflect on what it means for you to be counted in God's people. Don't take that term for granted. It may be a very common phrase for us to use, but just think about what it means to be described as God's people. Maybe think about some of those familiar phrases that you find in Scripture that describe God's people. Sanctified, loved, redeemed, they're just a few, but see which ones come to your mind. And just let yourself remember what it means to be identified amongst God's people, and let yourself be reminded that at the heart of that is your relationship with God. You are my God. Maybe just let that phrase turn over in your mind and see what it says to you as you think about and as you reaffirm that relationship that is at the very heart of our faith. And then some of those other words, those words from the beginning. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. What mattered to Ruth was being in God's place and following in God's way. And if that meant adversity and struggle, then so be it. If it meant blessing and success, then accept it graciously. And maybe those words offer a chance for you to just reground your own journey in God. Now, of course, we would appreciate an easy road. And this is not about belittling or brushing aside your struggles. It's about putting them into perspective and allowing ourselves to rediscover that what matters more is being in the place that God wants us to be, following in the pathways that God ordains, and recognizing God's covenant promise that our eternal future is safe in God's hands. And that sort of leads us to the other element, the final element in this covenant. Where you die, I will die, and where you're buried, I'll be buried. Those words might feel a bit morbid at first sight, but perhaps one of the realities of recent days is that we've all had to confront our own mortality. And that's frankly in a culture that often prefers to hide it away. And I don't think of these words as words of morbidity. And they're more than just even a commitment to life, though I sense that that's an important part of what Ruth is saying. But what I think she's also saying is, yes, I can talk about dying and being buried, and I can speak with confidence because I'm trusting in a God whose promise extends beyond life itself, so that not even death will be able to separate us. So no, this is not an invitation to be morbid. It's an invitation to reclaim our confidence in eternity and to be reminded that our future is secure in God. And so yes, this is a promise made to Naomi, but it's also a covenant made with God. And I kind of like the fact that the two interlace, because it is as a community that we love and serve God. It is as the body of Christ that we express our identity, which is why I would encourage you, if you can, not just to reflect on these verses on your own, but encourage someone else to look at them too, and then try and get in touch with each other and just find some time to share and to pray together. So I hope these thoughts are of help, and as ever, thank you for watching.